Hi there. Welcome to Bible Slash Chat. Gus, hello.
John, how are you?
I'm good. Long time no chat.
Exactly.
It's been what, like 30 seconds
Maybe
between
less.
this video and the last one?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
So the last video,
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
teased up a question,
Yeah.
right? About we did a video on head coverings, and we said, okay, head coverings are an issue that just happened in the first century in Greece or the Greco-Roman world, where now we are not in the Greco-Roman world, so we wouldn't think of head coverings in the same way that someone in the first century in the city of Corinth would think of,
Right.
right? But but then there are other issues in the Bible that you see and you can think, oh yeah, well that was back in the day, right?
Yeah,
And so how do we differentiate between the two and knowing what is cultural and what is not cultural? And the
Yeah.
question that we have is especially women teaching,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
When Paul tells Timothy that he does not allow a woman to teach.
Yeah.
Now, how do we know that's not a cultural aspect,
Yeah.
right? How do we know, and the aspect also that the man is ahead of the woman? How do we know that's not just a cultural thing that happened just in the first century, but now we know more and we understand that women and men are the same and there's no difference between them.
Yeah. Or even that, like, well, Paul's writing to Timothy, he's in Ephesus, and maybe there's some women in Ephesus who are
Yeah.
trying to take
Go out of control.
or
Yeah.
out of control.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is actually helpful, a super helpful discussion. And the reason why it's helpful is because Paul does something similar in both texts, but the similarity in both texts is not where we think it is.
Yeah.
So in 1 Corinthians 11, he addresses the issue of creation,
Yeah.
and he says God has created women and men in this binary masculine feminine role, and those masculine and feminine roles that men and women should be careful to stay within their lane, in a sense, in the masculinity and femininity that
Yeah.
God has created.
Yeah.
And the way that you do that is through cultural ways.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's wearing a head covering. And Paul actually says in verse 10, a woman should have authority on her head.
Yeah.
Now that idea of authority there is a sign of her position as a submissive wife to her husband, and that happens in a cultural fashion. And we would say that similar cultural error is what's happening in Corinth, and we can do the same thing in our culture. Have signs of authority, have signs of submission in our culture, and so we want to maintain masculine and feminine roles. What's interesting in 1 Timothy chapter 2, where is the verse that you quoted in chapter 2, verse 12, it says, "They do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over man, but to remain quiet." A lot of people say, well, he appeals to creation there too, because in verse 13 he says, "For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve." So he's saying, well, he's appealing to creation there too. Why would it not be the same?
Yeah.
Well, actually, if you just look up a little bit in verse 8, he actually gives us a cultural reference here. And this is the same as in 1 Corinthians 11, starting in verse 9. He says, "Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness." So there you have Paul saying, like, dress in modest ways.
Yeah.
Don't braid your hair.
Yeah.
And he's not saying don't braid your hair because having braided hair on a girl is evil.
Yeah.
That's not his point. Those are cultural ways, and we can talk more about the culture behind those things, but those are cultural ways of expressing modesty and chastity in the ancient Greco-Roman world.
Yeah.
So he is making a reference to the culture, and he's saying, I want you to have good works and proper behavior for a woman who's professing godliness. And the way you do that culturally is by not, for example, adorning yourself with all sorts of expensive stuff, trying to put on a show. So there's a cultural way there, and then we can have maybe a cultural application in the 21st century. Then he shifts gears. And he actually says, "I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." So here he's saying, I don't allow a woman to teach in the church, in the gathering, over men. And then he appeals to creation at this point. So he's changed gears. You have the adversative at the beginning of verse 12, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. And then he appeals to created order, and he says it was Adam who was first created and then Eve. So now the created order here, the order of creation, and then the deception that took place in creation is the means by which he makes that case. They say, well, okay, he's still appealing to creation, but the issue that he's dealing with now is a different issue. He's saying when it comes to headship or authority in the church, the way that those are functionally carried out should be men teaching women in the local gathering of the church. Now, say, well, it could be the other way around. He could just be talking culturally there. But he doesn't. He's not, for a couple of reasons. One is, in the immediate context, it's very clear that he's referencing the global church. And he says, I just don't allow a woman to function in that role. So rather than dealing with things that are cultural, like how you do your hair or whether or not you have a head covering, he's dealing with activities, roles that take place in the church. The role of teaching hasn't changed in the entire history of the church. And so there, when he starts to deal with roles, he's no longer dealing at a cultural level. He's dealing with the function of the church. And the second thing is, in the further context, the very first thing he says in chapter 3 is, if any man aspires to the office of overseer, it is a fine work that he desires to do. And one of the qualifications for being an overseer, which is what it is to do verse 12 of chapter 2, is to be an overseer. One of those things is to be a gifted teacher. So he takes this principle in verse 12 about men leading in the gathering of the local church, and he applies it to elders in chapter 3. So it's very evident that he's not talking exclusively about a cultural issue. He's talking about a global church issue when it comes to teaching and leadership. And then last but not least, the third issue that's very clear is in chapter 3, verse 15. He actually says, I'm writing so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. So he says, in the local church, this is how it should work. And these are the offices that should be there. Teacher and elder, a pastor and elder. And then if you just follow the flow of thought back to verse 12 of chapter 2, he's saying, don't let a woman do those things in that role. Now, does that mean a woman can't teach other women? No, of course not. Because he says, I don't allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. That's a technical term. It means she can teach kids, right? And all those, in all those categories, she can teach women, she can teach kids, and she can teach outside of the local gathering of the church. So you could have a woman who is teaching a theology class at a local college, and that's not wrong. So he's making a very specific, defined situation, and he's attaching it to a specific role in the church, an office in the church that remains an office in the church. So though creation is mentioned in both, it's mentioned in very different categories and different purposes and different goals. Cultural, yes, in both texts, but not in chapter 2, verse 12 and following.
It's really interesting that even when you went back to verse 8, when he says, therefore I want men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension. Like, definitely I see that as not as a global thing. Because lifting up hands now doesn't mean what it meant then.
Exactly.
Lifting up hands was it's not an exact one-to-one what we would do now.
You can't say you have to have your hands in the air to pray.
Exactly. What Paul is saying here, he needs to do this. They need to do this. And then again, there's that adversity there in verse 12 that explains what a woman should be doing.
In her role.
In her role.
Yeah.
And then the creative order is really important, right? The
totally.
creative order, I feel like, is super important because he goes back to creation. And he goes back to say, oh, it was Adam who first was created, right? The woman was to see, but this was not the punishment that she's not able to teach now. But this is what God wanted from the very get-go.
And this is how God created these roles.
Well, he would be the head of the
exactly.
Life, right? We can talk another day about a woman being preserved through childbearing.
I don't think we should. Verse 15 is confusing. No, I'm happy to look at that. I actually think it's Christ, but that's a totally different thing.
But that's another way for that. But I do think it's super interesting because I think that, and we talk about this often, right? How do we know a passage is cultural? How do we know a passage is not cultural? How do we know something is prescriptive? So how would we know something is descriptive? And I think you answer it for us. It's the context, right? What is the immediate context? How do I know this passage is not? And it's going back to all the way to verse 15. 15 all the way, chapter 3, verse 15, all the way to chapter 2, verse 12, in that adversity, which again, that shows you they need it, but even the bigger context.
The wider context. And again, we don't want to be like pedantic and say, oh, it can't, this one isn't, right? Because actually in verse 8 and verse 9, you have very clear cultural references. But the issue isn't those things. The issue is that he's clearly defining roles when he starts in chapter 3. And those roles are teaching and leadership for an elder. And if you just look backwards, those are the two things that he excludes a woman from, and he gives the argument for why.
Yeah.
So his thought process is much more complex than I think we give him credit for.
Yeah.
And for us to just try to find a way to squeeze in, well, that's actually the creation is just the same as it is in 1 Corinthians 11.
Yeah.
It's just not doing justice to the text.
Yeah.
So
that's excellent. Thank
Good.
you.
yeah, well, I hope that's helpful for you. And if you have any questions on this or any other topic, you can always email us at info@faithbibleoc.org. Thanks so much.